This podcast is brought to you by sarahraven.com, which is home to everything you need for a truly beautiful and productive garden. You'll also find great and essential gardening kit and stylish, lovely things to have in your house to bring the outside indoors, all inspired by the garden and the house being tied together. There's also plenty of garden inspiration, how-to videos and specialist growing guides. So head over to sarahraven.com today to discover even more. Welcome to Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven, and various different guests. And today I'm joined by somebody that I met at a wedding in the summer of a friend of mine, and that's Julius Roberts. And I've known about Julius for a very long time and followed him on Instagram, along, I may say, with the million other followers that he has. So I'm not unique. But it was really lovely to meet him then. And it's really lovely to have you, Julius, on the podcast today. So welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. It's such a joy to be here.
I really want to talk about his whole history of going from being a chef and then into setting up a small holding in Suffolk and then moving to Dorset. But we'll come on to that. But the thing that is really wonderful about Julius, well, lots of things, but I really love his book, which is The Farm Table. And yesterday, I was actually going into central London for a board meeting, which isn't something that makes my heart sing particularly strongly, I have to admit. And I started reading Julius's book because I always try and read as much of the books that I'm going to talk about as possible on the podcast. And by the time I arrived into Charing Cross, I felt the world was okay. And it's very difficult to think that sometimes, particularly at the moment. But the thing about Julius is that the way he's chosen to run his life and have his life isn't always easy, but it's brave and it's optimistic. And that's why I feel that you're all going to love hearing what Julius has to say. So that's a very brief introduction.
Can I just say thank you for that, Sarah? That is such a lovely thing to say. I really, really appreciate it.
Not at all. I genuinely mean it. I walked into the meeting and I just felt like, yeah, I'm smiling today. And it's because of your book.
That honestly brings a tear to my eye. I think hope is so important in this time. And to be giving a little bit of that to you I feel honoured.
I really do feel, and the written word as well as food and flowers and photography and sometimes Instagram. But the trouble with Instagram is it becomes a bit of a competitive whirligig roundabout merry-go-round. And I find sometimes if I'm feeling anxious or stressed, actually going on Instagram isn't a pleasure and a relaxant. It's almost makes me more strung out. Whereas your book it fed the places in the right way. And I mean that very genuinely. So let's spend some time chatting about it, and it will be just such a pleasure for me. So you trained for a year at Noble Rot. Just tell us about that stage of your life, first of all.
That was a pretty incredible stage of my life. I'd just come out of uni where I studied sculpture and couldn't really see that path panning out for me. So mum gave me a bit of a nudge and got me to go into cooking because I'd always been, from a very young age, obsessed with cooking, very much inspired by my granny, who was one of those old school cooks, lived by the Aga and created these incredible feasts, brought us as a family together, every Christmas, Easter, any excuse she had really. And she was such a kind of beacon of our family.
Yeah.
And I really picked it up from her.
Am I right in thinking she was Swedish?
She was Dutch.
Dutch. Yeah.
Dutch, yeah. Very, very Dutch. And had that real kind of European essence of food, how it's like a part of their soul, and that bringing the family together and that gathering moment is just everything.
Yeah.
So I got into cooking and ended up at Noble Rot, which was just opening and a incredible caliber restaurant for a first-time cook to be going in. And it was brutal. It was, incredible and inspiring. And oh my gosh, I learned so much, but it was so hard. I spent a year there in quite a kind of understaffed, hot kitchen that didn't have any of its creases ironed out. And it was quite it was a very intense experience. But there's this beautiful camaraderie, the like brotherly love and the instruction and the opportunity to kind of play and be part of this incredible team was awesome. But it did really wither me, I've got to say.
Can I interrupt there? You say brotherly love, because of course it is mainly, if not solely, men. There are not many sisters in there.
No, we were very kind of machismo, all-man team, battling a difficult job over the flames kind of thing. It really did have that atmosphere. And when it worked, it sang, It was so exciting when it worked, but the when it didn't, it's crushing. The stress is crushing. And you're getting back at 2 a.m, getting back up again at 7, on your feet all day. I'd be eating my lunch, standing there chopping, trying to just keep up with the, my to-do list of that day. And I spent a whole year essentially just being behind and chasing my tail and trying to keep up. But it was, it's important to talk about how inspiring it was too, because their ethos in that kitchen was extraordinary. And even though I'd been so into cooking through my granny as a kid, I don't think I really understood it, in what it meant. I think she did. She kind of lived with the seasons. She loved her offal, really believed in nose to tail, and kind of really took part in like where food comes from. But I didn't really pick that up from her. What I picked up from her was the love of cooking. But what I picked up from the guys at the restaurant was chasing the seasons, enjoying what was coming in, and kind of being really creative with quite a minimal amount of things, and quality being of the utmost importance. And that, while they kind of broke me, they did set me on the path I am today and gave me, the utmost appreciation and respect for ingredients and where they come from.
And you talk really lucidly about the importance of seasonality, which is sort of something that I hope everyone listening to this already is onto, because it's kind of one of our strands, really. But you talk also about the importance of seasoning, and particularly salt. I mean, you talk about salt, fat, acid, but I really love that section of don't think, as your doctor tells you, particularly if you have high blood pressure or whatever, is to put the salt in. Well, either never put the salt in or only add it at the end. But you talk very clearly that how you learned at Noble Rot that salt has to be there from the very beginning for it to do the flavor enhancement. I love that section.
Yeah, that came from the most profound thing I learned at the restaurant, 100%, was seasoning. It was this art of like bringing the best out of a dish. And what you've got to imagine is I'm sitting there in a kind of U-shaped kitchen where each of us are on our section. And every single thing I make gets passed up to the head chef. And he takes a spoon of it and puts it on the plate that's then going to go out. But he tastes it first every single time. And he had this amazing palate where he, his detection skills of could have more of this, could have less of that. And, that was this profound experience. And I think the way to think about it is that if you imagine a scale, salt is this balance where the more you put in, the more you will taste your food. It literally expands your taste buds to what you're eating. And you're trying to push it as far as possible without being able to taste the salt. That's the way to think about cooking. And the really important thing is it's not just on top of your food at the end. Because what that does is means the salt is just sitting on top and you will really taste the salt. What you need is for it to be just subtly and gently inside the food. And that's by giving each ingredient the time to sit with some salt and for it to suck it in. And then equally, it's a very important part of the cooking process too. If you put some onions in a hot pan with olive oil, they burn really easily if you're not really keeping your eye on them. If you put salt in there with them, it draws the moisture out and the onions kind of cook in their own juices and you get this beautiful process. And then if you had a taste of those onions, the salt would be inside them, not just sitting on them. And it works for everything. And not to be afraid of it. It's so interesting. At this time of year, if I'm working outside, you get a bit sweaty. All my goats will lick my legs and arms because salt is such a vital part of life. It is how we hydrate ourselves and it's how our body holds hydration inside itself. And I always think the goats are a great example of that because they'll literally lick my legs and arms clean while I'm, feeding them because they want that salt off my body.
Yeah. Let's go on to the goats, maybe, which is that you have a passion for rare breeds, partly because I guess you want to keep them going, but also partly because they create a more sustainable farm. And so there are very, very beautiful pictures in this book, by the way, everybody. They're shot by Eleanor Heatherwick, and there's really beautiful pictures of the Hebridean sheep and these British primitive goats. And I love that name. But Hebridean sheep is something that I was brought up with, actually, because I've spent a lot of time on the west coast of Scotland and in the Hebrides. But yeah, will you just talk to us a little bit about why they're better for small-scale farming than a lot of more modern hybrid varieties?
It's funny, on my journey coming from cooking into farming, it's been one of learning and making a lot of mistakes. I think the best thing that I ever did is get rare breeds as my choice of animal, and it's completely by fluke. But the thing that's great about them is that a modern breed has been designed to grow as fast as possible, get as big as possible. They're not really that resilient or hardy or tough because they're not the traits that are that important, and they've slightly had the wildness bred out of them. And you've got modern sheep who fall over and can get stuck on their backs because they can't get back up and get their eyes pecked out by crows, or just die stuck on their back. It's ridiculous. If my sheep fall over, they're hopping up straight away and jumping over a fence because they're tough and they're old and they're wild. And I think that's a great way to think about rare breeds. They're also just smaller, they're slower growing. If we had a wild landscape covered in these monstrous meat breeds that balloon in the space of 3 months compared to 2 years, there'd be nothing left. My sheep really are so much a part of their field. They take just what they need and nothing more, and they live within the habitat as part of the kind of circle of life. Whereas I think these modern breeds they're really not a part of that anymore.
And you just chanced on that, literally just out of a kind of slightly nostalgia instinct?
Yeah, I probably went for it because I think they're more interesting looking, they're more beautiful, they're the ones that just stood out to me. But as a farmer who didn't really know what he was doing at all, their hardiness and toughness and ability to give birth on their own most of the time and not get horrific foot problems or fly problems or diseases, is amazing. I did have some more modern breeds of goat alongside my primitive goats at the beginning, and they were such a nightmare. They were lovely. Their characters were amazing, and gosh, I adored them. But ulcers, abscesses, bloat, they were so big. I couldn't really flip them over to do their toenails. They were always getting feet problems. It was really hard to look after them. Whereas now, I just have to glance over my sheep once a day, and I get stuck in, to help one of them once a month, twice every, it's really, they just look after themselves because they're like a deer or a pigeon. They just know what to do.
Yeah.
And they also taste great. There's a lot
More
of
flavor.
lovely reasons too, but
yeah. So when you left Noble Rot, you went first of all to Suffolk, and you started with pigs, and they were called Snap, Crackle and Pop, as well as Albie. But will you talk us through a little bit of that bit of your history where you leave London and you go?
Yeah. So as I said earlier, the restaurant was an amazing experience, but pretty grueling at the same time. And there did come a point where I just knew this isn't what I wanted to do forever. But all those things that they'd been teaching me about seasonality, regenerative farming and all this, because they were constantly on hunt for the best producers possible. Those stories started to really inspire me, and seeing these guys turn up in the morning with, an amazing lamb over their shoulder or a crate of artichokes or tomatoes of the likes that I'd never seen before. I remember these blue Crown Prince pumpkins that we used to get that had the stems dipped in this red wax so that nothing could kind of escape them. And they were all turning up kind of bright-eyed, brown-skinned, smiling, and I'm there yellow, kind of on my 5th coffee of the day, just pallid and exhausted. And the stories they told our chef made me want to, go more in that direction. So I decided to become more of a grower and producer than a cook. But I made this decision in November, and
right, not the best time.
It meant that, I couldn't get a spade in the ground. I couldn't plant a seed. Chickens felt too easy. Everyone has chickens. So I decided to get some pigs as this very kind of big step into this new way of life. Moved out to Suffolk, right next to where my granny was, and began this journey. And those pigs were extraordinary. They were so funny and sensitive and clever, but like individual. They were so individual, and I began to forge this amazing relationship with them because I just spent my whole time sitting next to them, playing with them, chasing them. Me and Loki, my dog, would be in their pen all day, and the profound thing was just how much that shocked me. I bought these pigs as a chef who was into like a rare breed pig because of how great they taste and what we'd been using them for in the kitchen. And then I had these pigs that were becoming, just as close as I am with my dog. And that's a very scary thing, this inevitability that I did have to take them to their death one day, but I completely had fallen for them and was also just shocked at the kind of veil over our eyes of the way we eat. So, everyone knows that pigs are clever, but they don't really understand what that actually means. What it means is they have a soul, they have character, they have intuition, they have sensitivity, and you can relate to them very strongly. And I had such a wonderful time with them, but it was, ultimately led to some pretty hardcore heartbreak.
And so is it with pigs in particular that you felt that, which is why you don't have pigs anymore?
No. All animals. I think they all have so much more than we give them credit for. I think, chickens will surprise you. Sheep are kind of silly, but if you give them the chance, like, all these animals are amazing at what they need to do. The sheep's ability to live outside in the elements off kind of grass and herbs and flowers. And, I've come out in spring on a kind of March or April night with sleet, raining down on the farm completely horizontally, the worst weather you could imagine, going out with my torch to look for lambs to see if anyone's trying to give birth. And I guarantee you, if I look at all of my sheep, any one of those who have lambs will have that tiny little lamb who's not waterproof yet, who's still wet from being born and covered in mucus. She will be stood perfectly against the wind, giving that little lamb every ounce of shelter it can have.
Yeah.
She'll have found a great spot. If you're in a completely like just grassy field, she will have found that little dip where the land is slightly protecting them from the wind. They're incredible. I've gone out and, helped rescue lambs that are, stuck while being born, and the connection you can have with an animal that usually would run away from you, totally understanding that you're there to help, and there's so many instances where I could tell you stories like that. And that's a big part of, I think, what I like to try and give people is a sense that these animals are just like our pets and we need to treat them significantly better.
I think you should write a whole book about that, like Rosamund Young did about the cows. But anyway, that's another whole subject. But I suppose that it does take us on to the bit that I find living at Perch Hill, where we're on 90 acres. How big is? Oh, well, you moved from Suffolk to then down into the West Country.
Pigs turned into goats, sheep, a thriving veg patch, chickens, and I really started to grow as much of my own food as possible. And my family started really falling for these stories that I'm telling you now. I think the lessons that you're learning from nature are so profound. It rubbed off on everyone. And we all started getting stuck in. Lockdown happened. We kind of outgrew that little smallholding and have all moved together to Dorset to a 70-acre farm where, instead of having 10 sheep, I've got 150, and we all kind of work quite hard on the land and really treat it like a bit of a sanctuary, a bit of an oasis in the desert, where it's as much about, we call ourselves sort of nature first farmers. So yes, we have sheep, but it's the way the sheep interact with the land and the biodiversity that they help create that matters to us the most.
Yeah. And so that's what I was coming on to, is the thing that I find here. As an ex-doctor, I got involved with the obstetric department of our farm for a bit, and it went wrong a few times. And I found that unbelievably harrowing, and still it's kind of one of my flashback in an unpleasant way things that I have in my head, but also the whole abattoir moment. And so the picture that you paint in your book is incredibly vivid, and I have to say very beautifully written, of the loveliness of engaging with nature in the countryside, which as listeners of this, I kind of know your get is important because I've banged on about it now for nearly 3 years. But it's the harrowing bit that I find, you can't get away from it. And so you again talk about that very brilliantly, I think. But how have you learned to deal with that side of being a farmer?
I mean, I suppose there's two sides. There's the life and death that happens on the farm just naturally. A story I love to tell because I just think it's so profound is I went out one morning, 7 o'clock, middle of the birthing season, and found one of my favorite goats, Luna, had just given birth to the most beautiful baby. And I see this kind of chocolate mottled baby from afar. But as I walk closer, I see that it's not moving. Mm. And I came out, to this perfect little kid goat, that one that I'd been waiting for all year. It was a girl. It had the colors that I love, with a mum that I love. And it was just gut wrenching. There's this kind of heartache that if I'd been up half an hour earlier, I probably would have been able to save that. I don't know what happened, but generally, I think I can save any animal in birth just about being there. And if they're stuck, there's clever things you can do to get it out. But the beautiful thing was the mourning that was going on. Luna was, licking this goat, nudging it, desperately trying to get it to stand up. And all my other goats were standing around her in a circle. And she had, the most beautiful thing is that the instinct of a mother is so strong. And we know this in humans, but animals are so much more connected to their instincts than us. And she was just yearning with all her body to kind of feed and nurture this thing that wasn't moving. And she was going back and forth to her daughter from last year, Fern, nuzzling up against her and sort of, having, she didn't know where to place that motherness. And it was just, for me, I just sat and watched and kind of
cried.
Well, yeah. And just, was amazed at just how epic that was.
Yeah.
And so that leads us to the next thing, which is that, it's a farm. I grow these sheep and some of these goats ultimately for food. And, when just how wonderful and brilliant they are, that is quite a hard thing because, putting a load of your sheep that you've raised for 2 years into a trailer to go to their death to become food for people's plates is a really hard act. It hurts every time. I've been at abattoirs and they've said, I've said, please, can you just, these sheep really matter to me, be as gentle as possible. And they just go, oh, don't worry, it'll get easier. And the one thing I say to myself, I don't want it to ever get easier. I love that it's hard. It should be hard. And, it'd be much easier for me to not take part in that whole act, get someone else to take them for me or just buy my food from the shops. Yeah. But I love knowing that as an animal goes, they've had the best life possible.
Yeah.
And they've been part of nature. They've helped nature. And when they're on my plate, I care deeply about that whole process. And it makes you just eat meat less, which I think is a wonderful thing. I think we all need to eat significantly less meat, eggs, dairy. It needs to be a luxury again, like it used to be. And I think a lot of that is about caring about these animals, because to make it affordable, to make it available every day for the consumerist world we live in, they're the ones who've suffered so deeply. It is the biggest moral stain of the human race, I think, at the moment. And I would love for that to change. And it is about those little stories. It's about seeing that goat who is mourning. It's about seeing the instincts and the intuition of these animals and making sure that they live in a natural way, in the best way possible. I don't think the way I see it to myself is that we put a lot of onus on the death of things. Death is such a part of life. It happens all the time. And it's quite a small part of that animal's life. It's tiny. What is so important is the life that goes up to that. And I think for them to die and also live in abject misery before that is just horrific. But if we are to eat meat, they better live some damn good lives.
Yeah. And so 2 things that I want to ask you as a result of that conversation is you do name most of them, don't you? And that, again, I know is a lot of farmers will say, don't name them, don't sort of individualize their characters. But you firmly believe that shouldn't be the case.
I love that they've all got names. It means that I can see them as individuals and for who they are. You know, I go up to the goats in the evening and sit with them and, you know, chat to Nettle, stroke Hazel, sit with Gloria for a while. I noticed
Yeah.
that Fern's got a little limp or something. You know, it lets you really kind of see everyone. You know, my sheep sadly all look absolutely identical, but the
Yeah.
ones, you know, I can tell a certain amount apart, and, you know, they've got their names. And I love that about them. They deserve it. And it should hurt. You know, it's a part of this process of just caring about them deeply and caring about how they live and caring about what happens to them after that.
And I mean, I find the whole Instagram thing, which I mentioned at the beginning, but, you know, I might be holidaying on the west coast of Scotland and I'll put a post of some mackerel or a crab or some langoustine that we've got from our pots or whatever. And lots of people say how lovely, but there's always a proportion of people who say, you know, poor lobster, boiling it alive and that kind of thing. And I find that sort of, well, when it's anonymous, it's much worse. But I mean, with so many followers on Instagram, which you have, do you have that a bit? Do you have that issue as a farmer of meat?
I suppose what I love about my book is that it gives you the space and the time to
Yeah.
write something that is really you. Instagram does not give you the space and time. It's all about, you know, sadly, well, it doesn't have to be, but it can be quite vapid. And it just does open you up to a ton of people who just do want to poke the finger and give you hard times. I used to get a lot of it. I don't get as much of it now, but I probably don't share as much of. I don't think I share as much of this stuff as we're talking about now as I would like to, and I'm on a bit of a mission to sort of get back to that. You know, the book allows me the space, and it's quite hard to, you know, the detail and the importance of what I'm saying here just doesn't fit into a minute on Instagram, and it just, you know, it puts you on a kind of on the gallows, really.
Yeah, it does.
But I do think, you know, I think Instagram is, you know, I think it's incredible, and I think there's amazing people on there. It just, you know, sadly, the internet is quite there's always one bad egg.
Yeah.
And it's funny, you can receive a million great comments. They don't mean a thing. It's that one bad one that sits in your mind for a day.
It's so true. It's so true. Yeah. Great. Well, I couldn't recommend the farm part of this book more passionately, but it is primarily a cookbook. So let's move on to talking about food. And you're right. I think this absolutely genius phrase, which is cooking is what makes us human. And I read that on the train into London yesterday. I thought, that's genius. It is. It's like we are the only species, as far as I know, that that is combining ingredients to make them nicer. And I love that whole philosophy of this book, which is basically coming from a very similar standpoint to the sort of food that I like, which is that you've got food outside the door, not for all of us, where you and I are both incredibly privileged that we have that, but that if you source food carefully, you can have a similar quality, and the less you do to your food, the better. And that is why a lot of the recipes here, I just think, are really quite brave, because they're not chefy, they're not showy offy. It's genuinely like home cooking, and it's. I would like to say I think it's quite unusual as a male cook chef that you have that. You're not trying to show off. It is genuinely the things that you're cooking for your family, and I find that tends to be a more female trait. So that's another reason that I really absolutely love this and have given it to lots of people and want to give it to more people. But as we're going through autumn, I just wondered if you would pick maybe, I don't know, a few of your favourites, and I will interject with a few of my favourites.
Of course. Yeah, so the book is divided by the seasons because I think that's just the best way to cook. And there's a real ethos in there that if you find a recipe that you love, it's very easy to adapt it to the season that you're in. So I've got a lot of, you know, there's this dish that you mentioned earlier, spring on a plate, which I absolutely love to bits. It's a very simple braise of spring vegetables with white wine. So peas, asparagus, lettuce, a bit of, you know, sweet onion, all just cooked together with white wine and lemon, puddled onto whipped ricotta, and you just kind of dip and dunk with a piece of bread, or you can throw that exact thing through pasta. But what's nice about it is it's that method. It's this lovely pot of veg onto whipped ricotta. And, we're just coming into autumn now. What a lovely thing to do with pumpkins and maybe some pine nut and sultanas in there or something, a dash of vinegar. I really wanted to give people these kind of ideas that then they could pull through. And I think that's such a lovely way to cook. We've got a little bit locked in by recipes these days. The way I learned to cook is not by recipes. It's by being left at home by mum with a bit of a random assortment of stuff in the fridge and just having to, make something up. And I think it's really important that we get back to instinctual cooking and playful cooking.
Yeah.
And a great way to do that is to have these kind of slightly toolkit recipes that you have in your pocket that you can adapt depending on what's in the shops or what's kind of wrinkling up a bit in the back of the fridge that needs using up.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that it's just like, if you've got a really good cake recipe, you can put apples in it at this time of year, or quinces or pears, or in the spring it could be rhubarb or whatever. And it's having that basic thing in your head that is sort of almost second nature that you can just enrich with the different seasons. And that is very much the theme of this book. And it's one of its real strengths, I think, because I think it will appeal to cooks like me who've been cooking for 55 years, but also people like my children who have been cooking less long, but are passionate about food. So it's brilliant, I think.
Yeah, I like to think it's a very kind of approachable book. The recipes are deceptively simple. They're beautiful and you'll think that they are complicated, but I guarantee that anyone could cook anything in there and it will taste fantastic.
Yeah. So I'm going to interject one of mine now. And funnily enough, one of the people, she's our beginner gardener sort of representative in the company, and also has a balcony garden. And I was talking to her about you a couple of days ago, and she said, wow, his epic tarragon roast chicken is really epic. And I've tried it and it really, truly is. So talk us through that one, because apparently that's one of the most talked about recipes in this whole book.
Yeah, that's probably become the defining recipe of the book. It's so interesting as someone who's written a book like that, what people really pick up on and what kind of gets the most cooked. It's such a fun part of seeing it out in the world. And yeah, that is just a good old roast chicken. I don't think you can really beat a roast chicken as a family. I think it's one of those dishes that just is so comforting, so nourishing, so foolproof. It's so easy to get right. And the gravy, the kind of, for me, the three keys of roast chicken is I love having some nice brown salty skin. The chicken needs to be super juicy. We forget about this. I think people, that is the key. You've got to cook the chicken well, and that doesn't mean. I think people tend to overcook chicken a bit. There's this, if you're brave, you can just cook a chicken through and let the heat of it just finish it off, and you get unbelievably juicy chicken. And this recipe is spatchcocked, which is where you take out the backbone and open it out, so that rather than the legs, which are the dark meat and take the longest to cook, being tucked underneath your chicken, they're on top with the breast, and everything cooks at the same time. So the breast is still juicy by the time the legs cook. And then last of all, but probably most important of all, is just a damn good sauce. I like a wet, saucy chicken because I love the way the chicken sauce seeps into the salad on the plate or the rice underneath it. I think that's such an important part of it. And this chicken has those three keys. It's just tarragon, mustard, double cream, poured over a chicken, salt and pepper, garlic hidden underneath, and you blast it in the oven. It only takes 40 minutes and it is divine.
Yeah, excellent. Really fantastic. So more autumny things maybe from you.
Another favorite in there for this time, which I'm going to make today, is this. It's a ratatouille galette.
Ah, yes.
So I think people kind of forget in England that actually autumn is the best time for tomatoes, aubergines, these kind of things, because you've got to be a damn good gardener to have them any earlier than now. And for me, the tomatoes are, in their prime. And it's this lovely method of veg over whipped ricotta again, but on a galette pastry, which is this lovely kind of quite short, crumbly pastry that you don't need to do any blind baking with. I love it. It's a tart where you just fold the sides over it at the end. And yeah, it's ricotta with thyme, onions with anchovy, and then beautiful circles of courgette, tomato, and aubergine in rings over the top. And it's kind of, how aubergine's sort of meaty, the anchovies umami, the tomatoes are acidic, and the courgettes are just kind of zingy and light. It's so good. So good. I love it.
and so easy. It's just so great. And another one that I really settled on and have cooked here since meeting you is your lamb with anchovy and rosemary, partly because I love the fact that it's with Swiss chard, which is something that is the easiest vegetable in the world to grow 12 months round.
My new favorite veg. I'm obsessed.
Yeah, just so good and so good for you, and is so copious in its vast mountains of production. So to have a recipe actually naming it, I think is wonderful, including the stems. So will you talk us through that one?
Yeah, so I always grew Swiss chard because, as you say, it's sort of so easy and it's a very sculptural, beautiful thing to have in the garden. I've got to admit, for years, I didn't really use it. It just was part of the garden.
Yeah.
And then I went to my neighbor's house one day and he had just made, he'd had a lunch party the day before and he had some beef left over, some kind of dauphinoise or something. And the only thing he cooked that day was just boiled Swiss chard, drained off with olive oil and salt. And it was all the stems, cooked a bit first, and then the leaves just kind of draped around in this bowl. And I don't think I'd ever tried it, just properly on its own. And it is so good. Its spinach's bigger, badder cousin. It's kind of irony, it's oomphy, the leaves. And then the stems have the best juicy crunch in the world. So from then, it's become, there's no veg that I pick more in the garden. I'm always trying to wait for my Swiss chard to catch up with me. And this dish is the other thing I think is quite a new thing that is just so good for the world is these beans that come in jars that are just cooked so much better than the tins. They're kind of soft and incredible. And it's just a jar of those lovely beans stirred through some garlicky, lemony Swiss chard with roast lamb on top with this really simple sauce that is just explosively good. You just whack in a blender, rosemary, garlic, anchovy, olive oil, and squeeze a lemon and blitz it. And it's amazing to dip veg into. It's amazing over lamb. I love it on on roast chicken or smashed chicken thighs. It's a real kind of holy grail sauce.
Yeah.
It's a lovely, simple dish. I really like that one.
Excellent. Okay, so before we finish, because I suppose we should at some point, but I wonder if you'd give us your two final favourite recipes. And by the way, we'll put all these in the podcast notes, but you should buy Julius's book because you'll love it. But anyway, a pudding and a preserve, because it's that time of year.
Yeah, I mean, the puddings are probably the things I'm most proud of in that book. I'm not a pastry chef or a sweet chef, and I was quite daunted, at the thought of putting puddings in there when you see some of the amazing kind of more pastry-orientated Instagrammers or cooks out there. So I put a lot of work into them, and I really think they're so awesome. I mean, a favorite is this thing called a semi-freddo, which is you essentially make a mousse and freeze it. It's the Italian way of doing a no-churn ice cream. And, it's just whipped eggs like a meringue that you then freeze with whipped double cream too. So it's kind of aerated, and then you slice out this amazing thing. And it's with a shot of espresso in that slightly like tiramisu style, and roasted pistachios that you just pour caramel over and smash, and they turn into this incredible brittle. And it's a little bit more technical, I suppose, in that there's a few methods to it, but they're so easy. And what you get is this slice of kind of sweet, deeply coffee frozen ice cream with these little bullets of if you take a caramel quite far, it goes from being brown to this red color, and it's almost like a bit smoky and bitter as well as being sweet. And when you bite into those little pistachios, they explode in this coffee ice cream. Essentially, it is that is wildly good. And then preserve. Yeah, we're in autumn, and I'm sure you're kind of looking out at a bucolic, bountiful veg patch, but knowing that it's not going to be there for long. I love the preserving part of the year, and it's something that my granny really imbued in me. And so there's a bit on fermentation, a bit on pickling, but my favorite is this plum jam, where ultra simple, you just boil some plums with sugar basically, but you put in a fig leaf. Yes. And the fig leaf adds this kind of, I don't know how to describe the flavor of fig leaf. It's kind of coconutty floral, and it just gives this quite sharp, very dark red plum jam this little floating essence that is so good. So good.
Oh, great. Oh, well, it's so nice. Before we finish, what's coming next, I guess? Are you working on another book or?
I have, yeah. I started my next book a little bit too soon, and I've actually kind of stepped back a bit this year. I was meant to be writing this year and kind of started and then didn't quite like feel the flow. I think you really want, it was too soon to the last one. I can't, I put so much work into the farm table that I think I needed some time off to kind of want to do it again. The next one's going to be more of a diary. I quite want to, like these stories I've told you today of going out and seeing that goat mourning her lost kid. I really want the like individual stories and to show the way a year pans out and have the characters of the animals kind of flow through, and then with the food still very much entwined, because you know I think it's quite special talking about the way and why we eat what we do when. I love the idea of having this very kind of descriptive paragraph on the weather that day or a horrific job that I had to do, coming back soaked to the bones, shivering, and, making a really like warming soup and giving the food the real story as to why it was made. So
Yeah, that sounds
I'm
so
going to pick
good.
that up next year. And I think it will be, I'm really getting into, I think just the messages that I've been trying to say, I think they'll really come through well in that, because I think it's really important. I really believe in, I want to give the animals their voice.
And then in terms of, so obviously the book is just a wonderful thing, but if people wanted to get meat from you, would they go on your website or?
Yeah, so traditionally I've kind of sold my lamb. It's actually hogget is what I rear. I keep my sheep a lot longer. I think their long life benefits everyone. They taste better, they are better, and it's nice for them to have a long life. So that is the main kind of product of the farm. Last year I sold it through Piper's Farm, which was really exciting. They're a great farming conglomerate that support farmers in becoming regenerative. This year I'm going to try and sell it myself, because I love the idea of, I think, buying direct from a farmer and really knowing where your food has come from and the ethos in which it was grown is a lovely thing. So my plan is to do that this year through my website. I only have 45, so it's quite a kind of select thing, but I'd love to kind of have a recipe booklet in there for all the different cuts and give them a real story and reconnect people to that.
And the goats too, or what happens with them?
The goats are they're incredibly rare, and they're more for conservation. So it's kind of keeping the breed aligned. I don't sell many goats, but when I do, they tend to just go to other breeders. If I have too many billies in a year, i.e. boy goats, you only need one billy for 100 goats or whatever. So you can't, I've got an absurd amount of billies because I'm such a softie, but if I have too many, we might eat a couple, but
yeah,
it is hard with the goats. It's harder. They're super clever, and they really know what's going on that day. So I do.
Yeah. They're what we would call a house goat. And you would never milk them and make cheese or anything.
I've milked a few for fun, and often they have too much milk. So if a mum that traditionally has twins suddenly has a single one year, she will have more milk than she needs. And often the pressure, if there's this really interesting thing that happens where, say, the baby drinks from one side, and obviously an udder is two teats. If it drinks from one side and then it drinks from that side again because it's got used to it, then the other side gets quite swollen and painful. So then when it eventually does drink from that side, the mum kicks it off because it hurts. So it goes back to, and they kind of create this issue where they've got a ballooning udder. And so quite often I'll have to go out and relieve that pressure, and I might make some cheese from that. We had an awful year where I put a message out on Instagram explaining this. And another goat farmer who I really admire was like, the best trick is just tape up the good nipple, and it will force that kid kind of being hungry and going back again and again to drink from the bad side will fix the issue for you. So I taped up all these goats' nipples, and it did kind of fix the one side. But then I had all these, my goats are quite wild, they're primitive old goats, and by nature they are blooming naughty. And so I had all these goats in the field with these huge swollen taped up udders, and I could not catch them because the last time I'd been with them I was taping up udders and they were pretty pissed off with me. So we were chasing the goats around trying to catch them, to the point that when I pulled this tape off, eventually the milk just came out of its own accord. But it was a great example of a lesson well learned,
Yes.
And that's been my story of the last 10 years, is learning through an endless series of amusing, sometimes costly mistakes, but it's a lovely way to learn.
Yeah, well, that's a great place to end. Thank you so much for that chat. It was really lovely to talk about your wonderful book and your wonderful life full of optimism.
It's a pleasure, Sarah. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks so much for listening to Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange, the podcast with me, Sarah Raven, and the wonderful chef cum smallholder, Julius Roberts. Next week, I'm back with Arthur Parkinson, and we're going to talk more about biodiversity in the garden. So see you then. You can find more information, photos, and advice sheets on all the plants and recipes we talk about on this podcast by heading to the show notes or at sarahraven.com/podcast.